think also there are a number of emerging issues, coming to the fore as well. And in particular, I would mention human factors. And we've noted that, when people are fatigued at work, they're more likely to make mistakes and have accidents. So it's pleasing to see that, human factors is included into the agenda for this stakeholder engagement day.
Well, good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Ewan McMillan, and I lead on safety and health for the renewables and retail businesses within Scottish Power. For the purposes of today, though, my role is really as lead for the human factors workstream. Now, it's a relatively youthful workstream, both in terms of age profile, but also in terms of just how long we've been going. And it's fair to say that my group have wrestled with the definition and scope of subject of human factors. But what we're all committed to, however, is delivering something meaningful to the front line, to the field workers. I think all too often we could sometimes create in health and safety processes and procedures that can be somewhat remote at times. So it's really important that we deliver something meaningful to the field, and that's our primary objective actually in 2020. Only a number of weeks to get that landed actually. And we're considering factors such as mental health and well-being, demographics, a bit on ergonomics, and also fatigue. However, today I'm really pleased to introduce an expert actually in the field to advance our thinking on the subject. And so I have great pleasure to introduce Dr. Fiona Earle. A little bit of background on Fiona before Fiona kicks off her slides. Fiona is the Director of the Centre for Human Factors, a Chartered Occupational Psychologist and a Senior Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Hull. She has over 20 years' experience in the field of work-related stress, working with organisations to understand unique sources of workplace stress and implement solutions to minimise the impact of these stressors. She has recently led on industry projects with Humberside Police, British Transport Police, Orsted, Siemens Gamesa, and indeed the UK Health and Safety Executive. The focus of this work has been to inform and enhance practices in occupational stress risk assessment. The body of work has provided Fiona with relevant and valuable experience in effectively delivering applied research with multidisciplinary academic and industrial partners. So a nice blend of theory and practice, I would say. And we're very pleased to have Fiona join SafetyOn this morning and actually supporting the workstream going forward. Over to you, Fiona. Good morning.
Good morning, Ewan. Thank you ever so much for that great introduction. And before I start, I'd also just like to thank Lindsay and Beata and the SafetyOn team for extending a very warm and particularly welcome introduction to come and speak to you. As academics, the work that we do, in my view, doesn't really have any value unless we can apply it and make a difference to people's lives. And that's really the focus of the work that I've been doing over the last, many years. And I've worked across lots of different industries, but most recently, as Ewan said, I've done quite a lot of work in offshore wind, and I've come to have a great affection for the wind industry. And I think it's an area where psychology and human factors can offer a great deal. And I think David earlier said something about getting ahead of the problem, and that's very much what I would like to contribute to. I feel as though it's very, very difficult to be proactive in looking at health and safety. And if we apply what we know from academic theory and academic principles, and we use academic rigour to explore the challenges that industry are currently facing, then that's where the real value comes, and that's when we can get ahead of the problems and be proactive in dealing with health and safety. So it's a great opportunity for me to come and speak to you all. I'm very sad that I can't meet you in person, but hopefully there'll be opportunities going forward in the coming months where I can come and meet people face to face. A couple more things before I start, and I promise not to go on too long. As an academic, I often talk for 2 hours, so I shall try not to do that today. But I wanted to note the contribution of this work. My PhD student, Steffi McMaster, has just submitted her PhD that she's been working on in 3 years in fatigue in the wind industry. And so that's the topic I've chosen to come to talk to you about. Now, Steffi's very much an expert in this area now, having worked for 3 years specifically on this challenge. So hopefully I'll give you an overview of the work that Steffi's completed, but also if anybody would like to speak to Steffi after this, I should have put her email on the end of the slides, but actually I forgot. So please contact me and I will put you in touch with Steffi, or of course contact me directly and I'd be more than happy to chat with you. Before I begin with the talk, it's probably worthwhile saying that there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of my presentation. I won't be able to take part in the panel, but please do contact me afterwards if there's anything that you think of after the event that you'd like to discuss. Thank you. So Ewan at the beginning has just mentioned the challenge around defining human factors, and actually I didn't know Ewan was going to say that, and it's helpful segue into the first slide, because lots of people have heard of the term, lots of people haven't heard of the term, and even within psychology, not a lot's really understood about what human factors is. And I think firstly, that's because it's a really broad disciplinary field. We have engineers that are human factors specialists, we have computer scientists, and they all take a very different perspective and come from different academic disciplines, but they share this common goal of wanting to enhance the fit between human and their environment, whatever environment that might be, and whether that's at a very detailed level of how do we design a mouse, or whether it's at the cultural level, or whether it's at the organizational system level. We all work towards this goal of enhancing fit. And I think it's from that perspective that I've developed the interest in the work that I have. As a psychologist working in that field, what we bring to that work and to that broad goal is that we bring an understanding of human beings. We bring an understanding of the way that people work, the way that people interact, how social systems work, how sleep typically occurs, what impact it has on us, what challenging situations and how they impact on the way that people engage with those challenges. And we can bring our understanding of psychology to really help to address problems around this fit. Now, as I think Ewan briefly mentioned, I'm an occupational psychologist, and what that means is I have a focus on the workplace, and within that, my particular interest is really on understanding workplace risks. And this probably, that topic has probably dominated the last 20 years of my work. I want to work with organizations to understand their unique challenges. What risks do they have? What does a risk look like in this particular organization? And develop an understanding of that with the goal of enhancing positive work design. So it's a really proactive approach. The idea is to understand and enhance and offset any risks that are there and inherent. And all workplaces have inherent risks. I think onshore wind and offshore wind are particularly interesting. And one of the reasons that I feel so positively about working in the wind industry is it's my view from the work that I've been doing that wind technicians have a particularly broad range of risks. There's different risks in all sorts of industries, whether you're talking policing or banking or whatever it might be. But I think the breadth of challenges in offshore wind and onshore wind is really quite unique. And so this is an area that I've developed quite a big interest in recent years. Within that topic, there's an area of my own expertise. My own PhD was in the subject of fatigue, so it's an area, again, I feel very strongly about. And I started this work over 20 years ago, and sadly, I've still got more questions than answers, and I've shifted my approach a little bit. I began with trying to adopt an experimental approach to understanding how people break down in really very focused contexts. But actually, it became apparent that what's more interesting is what does fatigue do within an industrial context? What is it that causes fatigue? Where are fatigue risks? What does it look like in a given industry? And what are the consequences of fatigue? So it's this really sort of interesting midway between the cause and the risks, and the effect being the impact on the individual, their health, their safety, and their performance. And so that topic's particularly relevant, and I'm delighted to see that it's gaining traction in onshore and offshore wind as an area worthy of with focus and attention. So what I'm going to talk to you about is particularly a part of Steffi's research that was a study of fatigue in wind technicians. There was a small element of onshore wind, which I shall explain to you in a moment, and then there was a greater part of offshore wind. But the reason I wanted to talk to you about it today is I think it gives us a starting point for thinking about what could be useful activities to help develop understanding and policies and practices to minimise fatigue. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as I said at the start, I started working in fatigue about 20 years ago. I didn't think it was going to be as difficult as it was. It's a really common experience. Everybody experiences fatigue. We experience fatigue if we sit at our desk too long. We experience fatigue if we deal with difficult emotional problems. We experience fatigue if we have physical demands. But actually, even from an academic perspective, after 100 years of research, there's still a lot that we don't fully understand. What we do know is really incredibly helpful, and we've got a really good basis of understanding that we can apply that has value. Firstly, what's really central to this is this feeling of subjective tiredness, and that's really the warning sign that something that a person is in need of some sort of rest or a break. What's less common and what's less well understood is this underpinning subconscious shift towards low effort processing that occurs alongside the subjective tiredness. So we're unaware typically, but when we're tired, we start to move towards strategies of behaviour and performance and interaction that really reduce our effort. It's sort of a backing off experience where we are less willing to invest effort. And of course, there's all sorts of things which influence the extent to which people will keep on going. And in the real world scenarios and also in all sorts of academic and experimental contexts, there are a huge range of examples of where people can keep on going and keep maintaining performance under extraordinary conditions. But this comes with costs. And I think understanding the effect of this low effort processing and understanding what those hidden costs might be are really important. And it's not impossible. I think that there's ways we can do this. The sorts of impact of this low effort shift is and the ways that we're known to change in our behaviour when we're carrying out work is just to the right of the slide, these three examples of strategy shifts and shifting standards and changes in our approach to primary and secondary tasks. And I'll just explain a little bit about what I mean by that. So a strategy shift might be a tendency towards speed over accuracy, and that trade-off that we constantly operate within a speed over accuracy, and we might subconsciously shift towards speed. We might have shifting standards where our view of what is adequate or optimal performance might adjust, and also we're less inclined to pay attention to those secondary tasks, those things on the periphery of the work that may be incredibly important from a monitoring perspective and an engagement perspective, but they're not the core of what we're currently doing. And these known shifts and these changes in behaviour are really the mechanisms that underlie this relationship between fatigue and accidents and incidents and near misses. It's these shifts in behaviour which explain why accidents happen when people are tired. If people are willing to keep on investing effort because the goals that they have are incredibly important to them, there are costs. And as we know, when we've all worked extremely hard, we know that those costs manifest in longer term fatigue and burnout and mental health challenges. And I'll come back to that a little bit at the end. Thank you. So we know a little bit, well, we know a lot from an academic perspective, and also there's a great deal of support from right across different industries in guidance of how to address fatigue risk management and how do we put those systems in place. And it's great that over the last 20 years, there's been huge amounts of work in this, and now there's some really well-established fatigue risk management systems. They're based on really sound scientific methods and understanding, and particularly they're based on our understanding of sleep and what sleep disruption does to a person and how to minimize that sleep disruption. So these well-recognized and well-established fatigue risk management systems tend to be very effective in controlling working hours to make sure that people's shift patterns are optimal given the context. Now, the dominant models of these fatigue risk management systems are from aviation, and it's my view that as a consequence of this, and that's where this work really started in terms of developing risk management systems, that the emphasis of all of this work is on sleep. And there's a huge emphasis on shift design and minimizing impact on sleep patterns. And that's incredibly important. And I'd be the first person to say how important it is to get this as well, as optimized as possible. However, they don't typically address the full breadth and multiple sources of fatigue. As I said a few moments ago, we get tired when we sit at our computer for too many hours. We get tired if we have a challenging family dilemma or an emotional conflict. We get tired if we exert ourselves physically. So there's all sorts of sources of fatigue, and this is very, very true in a work context. And actually, the current approach to fatigue risk management systems tends to only address or predominantly address sleep and shift-related challenges. And it's my view that the way to take this forward as an industry is to start thinking more broadly about the nature of these multiple sources of fatigue. So just to summarize, we've got fatigue. We've got the fact that it's characterized by a state of tiredness, this subjective feeling of being tired, and that can be different for different people and different in different contexts, but that it's also associated to this aversion to further effort. And the causes of this are multiple. There's the psychosocial risks, those workplace characteristics like too much time pressure, mental demands, a low level of control. All these things are known to either cause or impact on the fatigue that's experienced, physical demands, emotional demands, and sleep demands. And fatigue leads to risks to health and safety and performance and well-being. And the work that I'd like to do is really understanding what these blue boxes look like for onshore wind. What are the psychosocial risks? What does physical demand mean to people working in this high-risk context and in these safety-critical roles? And what are the implications? What are the performance outcomes? What are the safety outcomes? And also, really, really importantly, what are the implications to health and well-being? And I think there's often a separation between health and safety, and really thinking about these as part of a whole and part of a process in which they're complexly interrelated is really, really important. So I think what the goal would be is to start to build an understanding of what these boxes are in onshore wind. So I just very briefly wanted to give you an overview of work that myself and Steffi have been carrying out particularly on fatigue across the wind industry, focusing on technicians. And I know there's much broader roles, but of course we have to start somewhere, and that was where we started, partially because of industrial interest, and partially because it felt like a sensible place to start given the breadth of the fatigue-related risks. And Steffi's PhD was the causes and consequences of fatigue in wind technicians. And really it was a two-phase study that started with interviews, a very small sample of onshore technicians, and a larger sample of CTV and SOV-based offshore technicians. And then the second part was purely an offshore wind quantitative diary study, where we looked at causes and consequences and patterns of fatigue occurring and recovery across 2 shifts. And the reason it focused on offshore wind rather than both onshore and offshore was we lost the opportunity to gain the data with the companies to which we had access. But it became more focused on offshore wind as we went along. The methods are really relevant, I think, for onshore wind, and there's all sorts of learning. But as you'll see from the next slide, that even in our preliminary interviews, it became apparent that there were great differences actually between the challenges facing these 2 different, very closely related but distinct and unique industries. The goals of the research were to first of all explore technicians' perceptions. As a psychologist, the first thing I always want to do is talk to people and understand what it means to them. What do you consider to be fatiguing? What do you think fatigue is? And what happens to you when you're tired? And then to really explore using quantitative methods, an understanding of what this looks like in a dynamic real-world context. So in a morning, in an evening, for several weeks, over the course of different types of shifts, how do those aspects of fatigue develop? How does the multidimensional fatigue, what does that look like in this context? And we came up with a really rich picture. There were 4 pillars of risk that we identified, the 4 really strong themes. Interestingly, and I can't really say too much about it now or else I really will run out of time, but they were very much compounded by culture. So the cultural context, in particular, the attitudes towards fatigue and mental health and weakness, what really did influence the extent to which there were negative outputs. So we have found physical demands, emotional demands, mental demands, and sleep-related disruptions, and that these were really different in onshore and offshore wind. Of course, the wind industry is really dominated by climbing as a physical challenge, but this is quite different in onshore wind and offshore wind from my limited knowledge. And in fact, in this really preliminary work, and I can stress it was just a starting point, it became clear that the onshore technicians had a great deal more demand physically as a general rule. But as I say, it's initial work. There's the marine transit in offshore wind, which I have a particular interest in. But of course, then in onshore wind, there's the travel associated to these really remote areas. And actually, that remoteness has an impact on the sense of isolation and an impact on team dynamics and these emotional challenges related to management support and a wider team support. I won't go into all of this in detail, but if anyone would like to talk more or chat with us at some point, please do give us a shout. The quantitative study, probably the key point that is useful to make is that the patterns of fatigue over the shifts were cumulative. So fatigue did build up over time within a shift pattern. So for those people working for 2 weeks, the relationship between demands and fatigue became stronger as these weeks progressed. So there's been a lot of information. Apologies that I've thrown a lot out there, but it's quite a complex subject, and I wanted to give you a sense of the nature of the work, and more interestingly, the perspective from which we want to address this. So just a few key points to summarise. It's incredibly complex. Psychologists have been working on this for over 100 years, and we still don't fully understand it. But we do know it's multidimensional, and we do know that there are causes beyond just shifts, and that industrial attempts to manage fatigue tend to focus on sleep and shifts and managing shift patterns. And of course, this is incredibly important, but it's not the only part of the story. So really, to understand what fatigue is from an industry perspective, it's useful to think about the multidimensional nature of the risks, the areas where fatigue has heightened implications for safety, and really probably the key message is that onshore wind has unique challenges. We can't just assume that what's true for offshore wind is true for onshore wind, and understanding where those risks are and understanding what they look like and what the implications are for your people, then that's really the key to progressing, I think, and really managing this challenge. In terms of next steps, I'm very keen to work with SafetyOn on the human factors work stream. I'd be delighted to engage with that. And really, we need to, the work that we carried out as part of Steffi's PhD was really preliminary research, and we need to do more work to understand what those risks are. And it'd be incredibly useful as a longer term goal to develop a multi-dimensional risk assessment that's designed specifically for onshore wind. Thank you very much.
Fiona, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Just before you leave us, unfortunately, you do have to leave us today, which is a pity, but, you know, I would say to everybody out there, if there are questions, please just bring them in. We'll capture the questions and make sure we feed them into Fiona. But there's three points really that I picked up on. Really, it was the cultural context and attitudes. That struck me strongly. I think any of us have done practical operational work, or indeed health and safety work in the field, know that is so important to how things go. The team dynamics and indeed the remoteness was the other point that I really picked up there. And you know, a lot of your work's been in offshore, but equally onshore we have an awful lot of remote locations, and I think that definitely drives behaviour. All organisations, I think, are looking at fatigue in one way or another in 2021 because, well, A, it's the right thing to do, but B, we know that the regulator, Trevor, and his team have shown it's a key interest for the health and safety executive. Just a very simple question from me, actually. Any thoughts on this wearable technology for capturing data? Is that part of the, it's only a small part, but it's part of it, I guess.
It is. I think that's a fair description. It's a useful and small part. I think there's some tools out there that I'm not sure I would be 100% sure they're valid and reliable. So the key, if you're looking at one of these techniques, the key would be to really review what evidence there is that it's valid, that it's actually measuring what it says it's supposed to measure. And by that, I mean, you know, showing that there's a physiological activation, for instance, it might very reliably measure that change, but that might not relate to the fatigue of that individual. And I think if I was reviewing the value of those, I'd want to know that there was evidence to support their validity.
Okay, that's useful, because I think it can be seen as a wee bit of a panacea, silver bullet, that you just get the wearable technology, you look at the data, and that solves the problem. But I think it's a piece in the jigsaw, but it's quite potentially quite a small piece, actually.
And the interesting thing about it is that it's measurable, so it becomes very attractive because we like things that we can measure, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a valid measurement.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. I am sure there will be many questions coming through, and when you've got a bit more time, we will get these to you and get the answers back into those who are asking the questions. Thank you again for your presentation. I'm sure it promoted and provoked a lot of thinking. And I think at this stage, we're handing it back to Q&A. So thanks, Fiona, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. you.